Today's show is brought to you by locally owned and operated Highland Rim Speedway. Highland Rim Speedway is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year with great short track door-to-door stock car racing in a safe, family-friendly atmosphere. Visit their website at highlandrim.com. From the family grocery hauler to fire-breathing racing engines, the one name you need to know is USA Motor and Machine, located at 51 Cleveland Avenue in Nashville, Tennessee. Give them a call at 615-726-3725 or visit them online at www.usamotorandmachine.com. Jeff Meeks and Chris Austin invite you to watch your favorite sports event at the Batter's Box at 43 Hermitage Avenue in Nashville, Tennessee. The Batter's Box offers shuttle service to all Titans home games. It's a great place for friends to gather for the game and after the game. So check out the Batter's Box Bar and Grill, and thanks again for sponsoring the show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Pit Pass. I'm Joe Williams, along with my idol, Larry Woody. And Larry, it's been another one of those interesting weekends as the NASCAR Cup season starts coming down to a close. Your pick to take the title. We're down to two. Let's get a couple things straight. We're down to two guys.
Two faces, two races to go.
Yep. You've got Brad Keselowski looking to win his first one. He's now in second place. Yep. He's behind Jimmy Johnson. And at Texas, that's where they finished.
Yep. And what a race, Joe. You've got the two guys who are in contention for the championship, and they keep running 1-2. And the Jimmy Johnson fans, that's good news because their guys won. Yeah. Brad Keselowski fans, not so good. Their guys 2. And I think, Joe, it's over. I think Jimmy Johnson, as you said, he's got a 7-point lead, 2 to go. It's Jimmy's championship to lose, and Jimmy Johnson's not noted for losing championships. He's got the ball on the 1-yard line. If he doesn't fumble, he's going to score the winning touchdown this week at Phoenix, and then he can start the victory celebration the following week at Homestead. I think you can stick the proverbial fork in it. It's over.
See, I'm not so sure. Weird things happen. NASCAR needs something weird to happen here.
They do.
Because Jimmy Johnson is a bit vanilla. Brad Keselowski speaks his mind. He's not as vanilla as most of them. So you've got an issue where Brad Keselowski might not be a bad thing. Now here's the thing he's got to fight though. He goes into Phoenix this weekend, and he's only been there 4 or 5 times. However, his opponent Jimmy Johnson has an average finish of about 5.3, and Larry, that's over a bunch of races.
There's 2 ways to look at Brad Keselowski. He's a bright young driver. He's never won the championship. On one hand, he doesn't really know how to handle something like this when it's a championship chase. On the other hand, Joe, he's too young to understand the pressure. You know, he looks around at his pressure. What pressure? You know, I'm battling a 5-time champion for the championship this year. All the pressure's on Jimmy. None of it's on me. He's almost too cool to succumb to pressure. So it depends on which way you look at it. Again, nothing against Keselowski. I just think Jimmy's too good. That team's too solid. It's too steady. I don't think they're going to fumble on the goal line. I think they're going to go ahead and put it away this weekend at Phoenix.
Let's talk about Texas a little bit because it's a classic situation where you've got 1 and 2 running 1 and 2. Yep. Keselowski kept getting better restarts for the first 2. Unfortunately, there was that last one. Yep. And Larry, after Johnson trying to make the move, these 2 guys got to beating and banging. It looked like the old days for a little bit.
Yeah, you got to give it to Jimmy Johnson. He's not tiptoeing his way to championships and hasn't in the past, Joe. He goes out there and races hard. He's not like some of the guys in the past who get a points lead. Now, of course, Jimmy doesn't have that big a points lead, so part of it's a sense of urgency. He has to race hard because he's got Keselowski right on his shirt tail. But no, he races hard, and neither one of these guys are tiptoeing to the championship. But again, it's kind of ironic because Keselowski is doing everything he needs to do to win a championship except beat the one guy in front of him. I mean, he keeps finishing second. Good news is Brad's finishing second. The bad news is Jimmy Johnson's finishing first. So again, he's doing everything in his power to win it, except Jimmy's just doing a little more in his power, and that's why I think Johnson's going to win the thing. But again, 7-point differential. It could something could happen. Jimmy could have a problem. Possum could run on the track, as we've seen sometimes in the past. Anything can happen. It's weird, but again, Jimmy just doesn't, historically, has not made those kind of boneheaded mistakes that beats himself and gives the other guy an opening. But that's why they run the races. So we've got 2 to go, and anything could happen.
I was going to say, and that, here's the other question I got for you, Larry. You got 43 teams racing in Texas. You got the 2 at the front. Who finished third?
Nobody knows. Nobody cares.
I got to be honest. I can't
no,
right now. I can't tell you who
No,
finished
all the
third.
attention's on the 2 front runners because they're the 2 championship contenders. I guess maybe that's the bad part. If there is a bad part of the chase, Joe, a lot of people, and Kurt Busch, for the record, third, but he's not in the championship standings. He's not a championship contender. So even though he runs an exciting race, he's probably the most exciting racer in NASCAR right now, and does some pretty good racing there in those final laps. He's an afterthought because he didn't make the chase. He's not one of the dandy dozen in the championship contenders, so he's an afterthought. So that's, if there's a bad part to the chase, I guess that's it. But then you could say that's a bad part about the NFL, because if your favorite NFL team doesn't make the playoffs, they're kind of an afterthought too. So that's just the nature of the sport.
Yeah, and I won't go there.
No.
I think you're talking about Kyle Busch, Kurt's younger brother. Kurt's still trying to figure out where he's going to wind up. You said Kurt.
Yeah, no, Kyle.
But yeah, everybody knows you're talking about Kyle.
Kyle.
Who is a kind of a case study in how too much success can kill you in future days.
He might have blossomed a little too early, as they say. No, he's still a tough racer. I mean, he did finish third, and he's run some good races this year. But he missed the making the chase by 1 or 2 points to Jeff Gordon. The last race of in the regular season, he lost that 12th and final spot to Jeff Gordon. But you got to give it to him. He didn't pout, sulk, and go home and say, "Well, I'll come back next year." He's run these past 8 chase races about as hard as if he were in the championship mix. But
and that's something, I guess, given some of his
past history,
personality, past history, that's a little bit surprising, because as much as I am not a Kyle Busch fan, you cannot take away the fact that he is a fantastic talent.
That's kind of strange, Joe. I'm a fan of Kyle Busch, the racer, but I'm like you. I'm not much of a fan of Kyle Busch, the person. He's got some.
That's the best way to put it.
He's got some personality quirks that he has to overcome, or he's not going to survive in the sport. I mean, he's already been suspended, once in the past. He's had all kinds of run-ins and problems, and Kyle is Kyle's worst enemy. If he can get himself under control, he'd be one of the greatest racers in history. But you can't win races if you're suspended and sitting home watching on television. So if Kyle can get Kyle under control, there's no. The sky's the limit to what he can do. But he's a tremendous racer, despite some of the personality problems he's had on and off the track. He's, as I say, he's probably the most exciting racer on the track right now. He reminds me a little of Earnhardt on how he races, but Dale Earnhardt Sr. was able to control himself off the track. He didn't let all this nonsense carry over, smashing trophies in victory lane and that kind of nonsense that Kyle has had, those kind of problems.
I was there when that happened. We won't talk about that.
I saw you jump out of the way when those Gibson guitar splinters started flying everywhere.
I have regretted that since the moment that happened. If I had done what I should have done, I'd never announced another race at any racetrack.
But you'd be famous.
I would have stopped that, and I didn't do it.
And you'd have been famous in NASCAR history. We'll talk about the Superspeedway in another segment too, and segue into that.
Last part here before we take our break, Larry. Looking at the TV coverage of the full weekend in Texas, and I want to go to Saturday specifically, where the Nationwide Series ran a race, and they've got a great points battle going between Elliott Sadler and Ricky Stenhouse. And folks, you got a situation where I know personally the guy who operates, or is the vice president, as Larry does, of Texas Motor Speedway. We talked about Eddie Gossage last week. It was amazing to me how empty the grandstands were. This is a Saturday race connected to a Cup race on Sunday with Cup drivers in the middle of it. And let me tell you something. If Eddie Gossage can't fill up or half fill up his facility with the ability that he has as a promoter, that tells me simply, no matter what Eddie does or no matter what a promoter does, Larry, there ain't no product.
I think Yogi Berra put it best. He said, if people want to stay home, you can't make them. So, no, you're right. If Eddie Gossage can't sell tickets, nobody can sell tickets. And it's the nature of the product right now. You know, the nationwide series, and again, we'll discuss this about the Superspeedway's problems. It's a second-tier series, and when your primary series, the Cup Series, is having trouble selling tickets, as they were at Sunday at Texas, you can imagine how difficult it is to sell minor league tickets. So, no, it's tough. Also, the TV ratings were down. Just again, Joe, the nature of the beast. This time of year, you got to go head-to-head with college football on Saturday, head-to-head against the NFL on Sunday. It's just a tough sell, both ticket-wise and TV rating-wise.
And one other thing that they learned that I've been preaching for years, and they learned it here in Nashville a couple of weeks ago, and they may have just accepted it at Dallas and Fort Worth at Texas Speedway. You do not run against high school football on a Friday night.
Not in Texas.
Not in Texas, not in Tennessee, nowhere in the South, if you got half a mind. Speaking of half a mind, since that's all I got left, we're going to take a break, going to try to fill it back up. When we come back, Larry and I are going to talk a little bit about Highland Rim Speedway. Yes, local racing still going on. More coming this weekend. Stay with us.
Microcasting for your city, Talkapolis.
From the family grocery hauler to fire-breathing racing engines, the one name you need to know is USA Motor and Machine, located at 51 Cleveland Avenue in Nashville, Tennessee. Give them a call at 615-726-3725 or visit them online at www.usamotorandmachine.com.
Microcasting for your city, Talkapolis.
And welcome back, everybody, to Pit Pass, brought to you in part by USA Motor and Machine. From your daily driver to a flaming race car, those guys can take care of you over on Cleveland Street. I'm Joe Williams, along with Larry Woody. And Larry, speaking of flaming race cars, Highland Rim planned on running a race last week. Saturday night, weather took care of that. So instead, they're planning the big season finale this Saturday night, which will be the 10th of November. Larry, it's hard to believe 10th of November, you can still go racing, but they're going to do it.
Well, and when you race this late into the season, there's always a danger that you got to combat Mother Nature. You know, you get into the threat of, windy, kind of raw, rotten weather. But Buddy Williams and his people at Highland Rim, they got a late start on the season. They're doing some renovations, so they wanted to race as late into the year as they could. But I think probably this weekend they pushed it about as far as you can push it. But again, the big news is that there's a race to be rained out and another weekend coming up, because maybe this time last year, Joe, I wasn't convinced Highland Rim could survive. It's it's one of those old historical old tracks, out in kind of in the rural area, quarter-mile paved track, and a lot of people thought the sport had passed Highland Rim by. So, to the credit of Buddy Williams and the other guys, they picked this track up, dusted it off, polished it up, and they're racing at the rim again, and plan a full schedule next year.
Interesting to note that when they first got back, Larry, of course, they had the huge crowd. They continue to have big crowds, and I guess the thing about it is, when you look at what they've done, the investment they've made, it's paying off. And my gut tells me they're going to run one more race this Saturday, more for the racers and the fans trying to get a few more events in than necessarily for their pocketbook, because it's going to be tough on the 10th of November to come back and race.
And Joe, when you talk about your pocketbook, that's an interesting point, because obviously these guys are not running Highland Rim Speedway to make a fortune. We're not talking about Donald Trump type of money up there. They're racing for the same reason. These guys are running the track for the same reason that the guys out and the ladies out on the track are racing. They just love the sport. They're running the sport for the sheer love of it, the enjoyment of it, and they know they're not. It's not Daytona, it's not Talladega, it's Highland Rim Speedway, and they're not. As I say, they're not going to get rich running those races on that quarter-mile track. But they love when you talk to these guys, the enthusiasm comes across from the promoters and the track owners the same way it does when you interview the race drivers who just won a 25 lapper up there in one of their old clunker cars. Why do you do it? Because we love to race. So I kind of like that.
I was going to say, that's something I know you've always enjoyed, and it's something that happens. In the old days, you might have said we're doing this so we can start to move up. Yep. Now, moving up means maybe moving up in a class, not necessarily moving up to ASA or some traveling CRA traveling series or a Ken 10 series. It's not quite like that anymore.
No, most of these people that race at Highland Rim, they realize they're not going to be. This is not a stepping stone to Daytona. This is probably about as far as most of them will go. Now, having said that, some of the younger guys and ladies, there's young lady races there, they do have aspirations. Yeah. So, we're not ruling it out. But realistically, this is a hobby level kind of racing, and they race simply for the fun of racing. And I think that's fun.
Yeah, and the scary part about that is if you go and watch, you see some great competition that's not just a hobby level, if you will. You're talking about folks who are looking, they are professionals, first off. Secondly, you're looking at folks, some still have that dream. And I know many years ago a fella had that dream, and his name was Bobby Hamilton Sr., and he was told not to have that dream, that he couldn't go anywhere. Another one that came through, there's a kid by the name of Bobby Hamilton Jr. who was told, Larry, don't have that dream. You're not going to be able to go anywhere. And where does he wind up? He winds up on the Cup level too. So
Casey Atwood got a start up there. Chad Chaffin, a lot of prominent names. And again, I think those we need those kind of tracks. First of all, they're fun to watch the races on. Secondly, they do provide a stepping stone for some of these guys. It might be a 1 in a million shot, but at least it's a shot. And if the tracks like Highland Rim go away, I'm not sure where the next young stock car drivers will come from. And also, your track, where you spent so many Saturday nights, and I have too. Also, the old fairgrounds. It's still up and running, and that's another, I guess, survival story. That because this time last year, some of us weren't sure the old fairgrounds would still be operating.
Actually, I guess yesterday, day before, as we film this on Wednesday, earlier this week, I'll say. That's the easier way to put it. 3 people put in applications or bids, if you will, to operate the racetrack at the Tennessee State Fairgrounds, also known as Nashville Speedway. Tony Formosa Jr. has held that contract for 2 of the last 3 years, and apparently will retain it for at least 1 more year, and potentially for a 2nd year after that. Now, 2 other groups were involved. One, Jim Atkins, who is a local businessman, Larry, who did a lot of sponsorship work with Tony last year, and then something happened and it didn't go real well. That was apparently not a nice split. Also, driver Andy Johnson, in cooperation with the former general manager there, Charlie Welch, put in a bid, and that's a situation where Charlie had worked with Tony and he's not working with, it's an interesting situation to see how this is all going to play out.
But regardless of who's running it, and in this case it'll be Tony Formosa for next season, the track's operating. So again, Joe, the good news is there's going to be racing at the fairgrounds. And again, last year it was like somebody that's you've come across an accident victim, and the first 2 things in first aid, you stop the bleeding and you clear the passageway, the air passages. And at least Tony was able to stop the bleeding and clear the air passages, and he's maintained life in the old track, because I think if it had gone a season without racing, I don't think it ever started again. It's like an old car, once it gets cold it won't start. And I think if Tony Formosa and some of his people hadn't been able to keep it going, I think it would have been dead. So to Tony's credit, I think he saved the track. Now the big question is, can he, now that he's still got the vital signs going, can he operate it successfully in the future? So that remains to be seen.
Yeah. Now, in the spirit of fairness, I think I need to let everybody know right now that yes, I was involved with a group last year who made a bid against, I hate to say against, we made a bid for the racetrack. It included several prominent folks, including Sterling Marlin, Chad Chaffin, Bill Freeman, and others.
Again, the good news is there's a lot of people who want to run the track.
Obviously, the fair board, the cash on the table was not that important. They went a different direction. So you've got to wish these guys the best. They've got another year, maybe 2. The hard part for them, I think, right now is to overcome the hard weekend, I'll call it, that they had with this last All-American 400, because attendance was extremely poor. Timing was bad, number 1.
And again, it goes into some of the things we're talking about the Cup Series. Even the Cup Series is having trouble this time of year, going against Saturday college football Sunday, NFL, and everything else going on, high school football on Friday nights. So if the Cup Series, if Eddie Gossage at Texas Speedway is having trouble selling Cup tickets, you can imagine what a tough sell it is out at the old fairgrounds to sell tickets. So, but again, the way I look at it, Joe, it's like if your old college team changes football coaches, despite who's coaching the team, that's still your school and you still pull for it.
Yeah,
so that's
exactly
the way I look at the fairgrounds. Regardless of who happens to be running it, I'm still pulling for it. I hope it's a success.
Oh, and I think we all are. I think that's important, and that's one of the things that I was going to add. It's a totally different marketplace today than it was 10 years ago, 11 years ago.
Yeah.
You could run Saturday afternoon and kind of get away with it. Vanderbilt wasn't that hot at the time. They're hot again. Tennessee didn't have as many troubles.
Yeah.
But to run that race on Saturday night, or we couldn't run it on Sunday because you've got the Titans. Larry, this, in fairness to whoever's out there, Tony included, this is a whole different market in Nashville than we ever dreamed of 15 years ago.
Oh, it's turned upside down. It's just tremendous market. Back in the so-called good old days when I was the beat writer to Tennessee, and stock car racing, particularly at the fairgrounds on Saturday night, that was front page stories. We'd send photographers out. J.T. Phillips, a wonderful old racing photographer. We'd have front page photographs on the front on the sports section. Sometimes it'd be the streamer story on the front page. Cuckoo Marlin wins 5th race. And even as you know, you were doing announcing at the time when Sterling Marlin, Mike Alexander, PB Crowell, some of those kids were racing. It was still front page news. And now the landscape has changed. We've got Titans and Predators prowling the land, and just so many things going on, competing for the fan dollar, also even through the summer. I mean, Titans is 12 months a year show now, even spring training camp, summer camp, all that stuff. So it's just a tough sell. And as I've told our friend Terrell Davis, if I have a complaint about any of the people, not just Tony but anybody out there, I don't think they've done a good job marketing the track. And it's you live or die with public relations, because again, the best racing in the world is no good if nobody knows it's going on. And that's not necessarily a fault of Tony, because I know he's got limited resources and he probably does the best he can with what he's got, but they've got, whoever runs it has to figure some way to do a better job of publicizing, because there's some good human interest stories out there, great stories, and but people don't hear about them. And so I've got a good friend who's a big racing fan and went to Daytona with me for about 30 years, and he was surprised to know they were still racing at the fairgrounds. And he's not a casual fan, he's a serious fan, and he didn't know they were going on. So that's an obstacle they've got to figure out how to overcome. Again, I'm not smart enough to know exactly how to do it, but I can identify the problem. It's lack of attention, and the track can die on the vine from lack of attention. So they've got to figure out some way to let people know that track's still running, and there's some good, exciting racing and some great human interest stories out there.
One of the things that can't happen too is even when there is all of these resources in place, you still can wind up without racing. We're going to talk about a local racetrack that wound up in just that exact shape when we come back for the final segment of Pit Pass. Stay with us.
Microcasting for your city, Talkapolis.
Today's show is brought to you by locally owned and operated Highland Rim Speedway. Highland Rim Speedway is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year with great short track door-to-door stock car racing in a safe, family-friendly atmosphere. Visit their website at highlandrim.com.
Microcasting for your city, Talkapolis.
Welcome back, everybody, to the final segment of Pit Pass this week. Joe Williams, Larry Woody, and Larry, we were talking just a couple of minutes ago about racetracks that survive, and you're kind of surprised, and the rebirth at Highland Rim, the continuation at the fairgrounds. And we talked about there's one place around here that should have made it, could have made it, didn't make it.
So far it hadn't. Nashville Superspeedway out in Gladeville,
yeah.
Wilson County. And Joe, it's still puzzling. I remember, and you do too, we went out for the big grand opening, well, it had been 12 years ago, when Dover, Delaware sent Dennis McGlynn down here, the CEO, and he and Bob Harmon and a lot of the city officials and Wilson County officials went out, and Cuckoo Marlin's there, Sterling Marlin, Bobby Hamilton, a lot of the drivers, and they had the property staked off, and they rode a bulldozer around, and Harmon moved some dirt around, and it was such an exciting time. Nashville's going to have its own super speedway, a 1.3 mile track, state-of-the-art track, and turned out it's one of the as good a racetrack as there is in the country. But for what it's, Joe, I've written stories. It's kind of like Nashville's Field of Dreams, only they built it and they didn't come.
Yeah.
They being the fans. It just was abysmal from the first race, Joe. I remember they had a nationwide race, and the track seated about 50,000, including some temporary scaffolding seats they put up. We went out there, and it might have been half full. A week later, Dover started dismantling the scaffolding, and I wrote a story saying it's not a good sign when a track starts taking its seats down. And,
first race.
And of course, Cliff Hawks, the general manager, didn't like that, but it was a fact. You know, if Neyland Stadium in Knoxville starts dismantling seats, it's a big deal, and it's a big deal at the fairgrounds. And sure enough, that opening race was sort of a harbinger of problems to come. They struggle with attendance from the opening race on to the final race August before last, and it's a puzzler, Joe. Why it didn't draw.
Well, I think, Larry, there's a couple of things. First off, one of the things I kept kind of trying to get them to go along and do was to do what they did in Kentucky, because Kentucky now has a new owner and has a cup race, and that is paper the racetrack. If you got 50,000 seats, fill them up one way or another, even if you got to turn around and give a lot of kids free tickets from the Nashville neighborhoods if you need to. But there were I think there were three things that hurt them on some decisions they made. Number one, great racetrack. Concrete was a fantastic idea, but he wound up making a 1.3 mile cookie cutter racetrack. They just took the 1.5 and brought it down a little bit. Secondly, that made for some not exciting racing at times. But thirdly, they didn't finish what they started and what they said they were going to do, which was the entire complex, the drag strip. All the groundwork, Larry, was done on the initial phase. The drag strip
it's in the architect's plans, original plans.
The groundwork, the drag strip's there. The asphalt short track is there. The dirt short track, everything is in place. The complex is ready to be completed. They never did that. What made them successful is they fought attendance problems where they were able to do testing, NASCAR testing, and testing brings in good money. And then about 6 years ago, NASCAR said, here's the deal. You will no longer be allowed to test where we race, where any of our series race. So the Cup guys can't come to Nashville, even though there's not a Nashville Cup. There's not a Cup race in Nashville. There's a what was then a Busch and nationwide race and a truck race. So the Tony Stewarts, who may be interested in the place more than we know, for example, couldn't come here and test. It'd be a violation of NASCAR rules. Now instead, one of the changes, we're going to talk about this next week. Now, guess what? You can test anywhere you want to.
Well, back to your points, Joe. First of all, I agree. The design flaw was the start of their trouble. They built a 1.3 mile track, semi-high banked, and they tried to get a hybrid track that they could run stock cars on it and Indy cars. They ended up with a track that's not very good for either. My suggestion was build a clone of Bristol, because that's the most successful track in the state, in NASCAR probably. Build a little Bristol. They didn't listen to me. That was their first mistake. I'm kidding. Dover knows what to do, but it was a design mistake. Secondly, they thought they could sell minor league racing, and no offense to the Cup Series and the Nationwide Series, but those are second and third tier series. They couldn't sell minor league racing in Cup territory. Nashville is big league racing territory. We got spoiled by having 2 Cup races at the fairgrounds all those years, and people just aren't interested in second and third tier races. So Dover tried to sell a product that people weren't buying. I have a good friend, the guy I was telling you about, who didn't know the fairgrounds are still running, lives in Murfreesboro, just a few miles down from the track. And in the 10 years that the Superspeedway raced, he never went there. Now he goes to Daytona, Talladega, all around the country and watches Cup races. And he said, sure, if they ever get a Cup race at the Superspeedway, I'll be standing in line to get a ticket, but I'm not interested in those races, Cup and Nationwide. So they're just trying to sell a product that that people weren't buying. And also they're kind of a victim. Why didn't they complete all the tracks that the rest of the complex they designed? I think the economy hit them, for one thing, came in at a bad time when the economy started to bottom out. Secondly, they're absolutely stunned at that sea of empty seats at the season opener. They say, oh my goodness, did we overestimate the market here in Nashville when they start dismantling those seats for the season opener. Do we really want to go ahead? We put about $100 million in it. Do we want to put another $50 million in building all these others if we can't sell out what we've got? So I think Joe, Dover Motorsports was a victim of a perfect storm. They built this thing, and they might have survived one or two little things: the design flaws, the bad economy, the minor league racing, and all this, but combined, it was too much to overcome, and so now it's sitting out there growing weeds.
Dover did a good job, and I'm not sure they're recognized for their ability to be the soldier for NASCAR that I think they have been. You know, they built Nashville after they had bought St. Louis and Memphis. St. Louis was a tough gig. I got to tell you, I was up there, did a couple announcing gigs there. Their first then Busch race, the track started coming apart. I mean, it was hotter than, it was that hot. Memphis was a little bit different. It was 3/4 of a mile, and it was an exciting place to race. It just struggled a little bit. And then they built Nashville, and what wound up happening is these three racetracks soldiered for NASCAR. Dover had the majority of races that were not cup events, that were truck and nationwide races outside of as far as standalone events. Not the ones that are combined with a cup race somewhere. But as far as standalone events, they were the soldier for NASCAR.
Which is a tough sell.
That's a tough sell. And I think they kind of got the short end of the stick.
And again, I don't want to sound too critical for Dover about Dover, Joe, because nobody's more disappointed than they are. That's their $100 million that's sitting out there in the bean field, and they worked so hard. Dennis McGlynn, the CEO, came in personally week after week and supervised the construction and helped with some PR and so forth. So I'm not blaming Dover for it. I'm just saying Dover's almost a victim of circumstances, and the bottom line, however, is we got this beautiful new track that doesn't, in my opinion, have much of a future, because if you can't run races on a racetrack, it's not worth much, and frankly, I just don't see much future for the old Superspeedway.
So I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I think there's a chance. I understand that there's always been talk about people being interested in buying the place, and I think there's some folks out there who are pretty serious now. I know my partner Malcolm West and I on an old radio show talked about a deal back in April.
This will be a good topic for maybe next week's segment.
Yeah, it may be.
The inside scoop on the Superspeedway.
Well, but I was going to say, the thing about this, I think there are a couple of people looking, Larry, that we don't even know are looking, and they're serious. And I keep going back to Bruton Smith as one, because the first thing Bruton said was, I'm not interested in Nashville, it's not sexy enough. Right. Well, that's like Donald Trump saying you're fired, but I want to see you tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah. And another prominent race driver may have sniffed around a little too, but again, that might make a good segment for next week. How's that?
We may hold on to that.
All right.
All right, coming up this weekend, we've got Highland Rim, start racing at 4 o'clock. I plan on being there. That ought to be a great weekend. Great night of racing.
Yep.
May have bundle up a little bit, but that's okay too.
Yep. And
then Sunday, Cup guys go to Phoenix.
Yep.
Land of the rattlesnake and sand.
2 to go.
You know, Phoenix is kind of, and you don't know what's going to happen. You remember it was 5 or 6 years ago that Kurt Busch, the old Busch, got fired in Phoenix. Didn't even know it. That's what the funny part is. We had a friend of ours on the phone who called and said, "Hey, they're passing out press releases at the back of the trailer. Kurt Busch has been fired." What's his reaction?
He said,
he doesn't know. He's still trying to get in.
He said, "Let me see one of the press releases."
Yeah.
I still say, Joe, somewhere in an engraver's office, there's some engraver with a big silver trophy in front of him saying, "Does Jimmy spell his name with an I or I-E, with a Y or an I-E?"
So you called it. It's done. Larry Woody says it's Jimmy Johnson. I'm not ready to give up on Keselowski just yet, even though...
You can't spell Keselowski.
You got that right. Even though 2 weeks ago, he picked Keselowski and I picked Johnson.
Of course.
Go figure.
Here's a guy who picked Jeff Gordon.
Well, that's true. Tell you what, Pit Pass will be back next week. Thank you so much for joining us. Special thanks to Highland Rim Speedway and to USA Motor Machine for making all this possible. For Larry Woody, I'm Joe Williams. We'll see you next week. Get to a racetrack somewhere, will you?
Microcasting for your city. Talkapolis.